Hello and welcome to this month's painting tutorial. This month I'd like to take a look at how to paint a figure in a landscape setting. And also I'm going to incorporate water, rocks, and foliage with some strong light struck patterns. So let's begin by sketching this on our watercolor paper. And remember, the first step is to determine your horizon line. There we go. This is about where I want the person to be, and I want them to take up about this much space. So I'm going to start with a stick figure and make sure that the arms and torso are angled correctly. Then I can start to flush it out. So there's an arm, and there's an arm, there's the waist, and the legs. This leg is taking the weight, so it's pointed straight down. This leg is lifted up. So you start with the head and you work your way down using simple lines to determine the center of the body and the angles of the arms and legs. Then of course you need to clean it up. You can do that with a kneaded eraser. Just clean up those junky lines that you don't need, and that will help you to determine if you've made the body shape correct. Then she's reaching for a rock here. Her back foot is hidden by a rock. Then I'm kind of sketching in the shape of the shadow that surrounds her, because that's this really strong element of the piece. So that shadow, the foliage comes up here and almost touches her hand. And then all of this is light, and all this behind is dark. And there's some tree branches sticking out of the darkness. So that's good for this sketch. Once I'm pleased with the really basic sketch, I'm going to tighten it up with a graphite pencil. See, now I can clean up those little shapes. So you see how I erase little pieces of my sketch, and then I clarify them with the graphite pencil. Don't erase everything at once, or you'll lose the benefit of having sketched it out already. There. Now, use your masking pen and pick out the little highlight shapes that you see on the photo. So there's some sharp shapes on the arms and on the head. Go ahead and preserve those. Then there's some grass shapes and some sharp leaves that are being caught by the light. I'm going to preserve those with masking fluid as well. And keep in mind too that you can spatter with masking fluid the same way that you would spatter with paint. You can do a combination of spattering with the masking fluid before you start painting, and then spattering later on with your dark paint on top of that, and that will be a nice effect. So let me take some time off camera and go ahead and finish with the masking fluid. I'll come back when it's time to start painting. Once the masking fluid is dry, you can start to paint. And remember, you always paint back to forward. So I'm going to start by painting some of this foliage in the background. It's really messy and speckled with several different colors, so the best way to go about putting it in is going to be to fling in the droplets and do some speckling. So first, let's protect the surface of the paper that we don't want to be covered with speckles, and also these light colored bushes that we want to keep out of the dark paint as well. Some scratch paper underneath, and then just tear up some pieces of paper and put them on the bottom half of the picture and in those bushes. I'm also going to tear off a skinny piece and protect the figure a little bit. Okay, now let's start to fling in some droplets. Mix up a nice puddle of some dark greens and yellows. Now I'll get a nice round brush and just start to tap those colors in. You can tap and you can fling, because both are going to give you different patterns. And then remember, when you've gone a ways, you can use a little water bottle and just give it a gentle spritz. You're not soaking the paper, but you're spritzing it to help your droplets of paint move and mix together. And then in some places where the green is really thick, you can just roll a texture from the brush right over the surface like this. Then just fling some more dots over the top, and you're good to go. While you're doing this too, squint at the paper And make sure that you're keeping true to the patterns of light and dark, because a lot of the interest of the piece is going to come through that way. And then gently remove your masking papers and see how the picture's coming along. Before I let everything dry completely, I'm going to use my same round brush, and I'm going to carefully outline this person, and I'm doing it before those colors dry so that the background color blends in better. But we have to keep her lines nice and distinct, or we'll lose the fact that this is a person. Then when I'm done with the figure, outlining it like this, I'll be in a good place to put it away, let the foliage dry completely, and then we can come back and I'll show you how to push forward more. When the darks in the background dry, your painting is going to look something like this. So the next thing that I want to do is slice in those tree shapes. So I'm going to use a flat, get it just damp, and then mix up a gray. I want to stay consistent with the picture so that I have these nice strong shapes. And I'm not removing my masking fluid yet, because there are going to be areas like right here where the tree goes over some of those shapes that I've masked out. I had to wait until now to do this because otherwise I couldn't get clean outlines. I'm adding just a little bit more brown to these tree branches to make them stand out from the rest of the background shapes. Okay, now let's move into the foreground a little bit. I'm going to lay in this path, so I'll use a watercolor test paper. I paint right on the edge, put it up to my picture, and then see how close I am. It's a good idea to do that even if you don't necessarily have to have it match exactly, because you'll have a better idea of what it's going to look like before you put it down. So then I can start to use the brush on this edge and paint in some of these darker ripples in the water. And the foreground has some shadows in it as well. And then see, I dip the brush in the water and run it over the top of some of these shapes because I don't want them to be too distinct. And it gets really light struck over on this left edge. So I'll rinse out my brush almost completely and then wash it in like this. And I'll throw in some darks right in here where I see some shadows around rocks. But the paper's really wet, so I'm not going to have any really distinct shapes. I just want to have enough detail and variation to give the impression that there's something going on here. But mostly I'm just trying to capture the basic shape of this dark patch transitioning around some lighter rocks. Then we'll see how it looks when it dries, and I can tighten that up more if I want. Now for those really light colored weeds, I'm going to get some lemony yellow on my brush and start to just sort of whip in a few lines of grasses here and there. And if I want those to be smaller, I can go to a rigger brush. I don't want to go nuts with that, but this is an easy and fun way to develop some of those grass shapes. So right now this is just kind of establishing the basic shape. After it dries, I can go back in and work on some of the details. Now there's some really dark darks back in here, things like that. I can't do that work until this is completely dry. So this is where I'm going to leave it, and we'll come back and add some details to the grasses and in the foreground. This is all nice and dry now, so let's do some more work on incorporating the background and the foreground. So I'm going to get my large flat damp again, and I'm going to do some more work carving out some of these little grass shapes. So we're going to work on the negative shapes around the grasses that are sticking out, and then also you can paint those with the opaque watercolor paint. So just slice in some shapes like this, and I'm painting some of the dark shapes in the grasses in here. But before I do too much of that, I'm going to use my masking pen, and I'm going to preserve some more of these grass shapes on top of the light area that I've already painted now that it's dry. So I'll just take some time and carefully paint these grasses. Then I can paint over the top of them when the masking fluid is dry, and that will preserve another color of grass. So I'll have the white, and then I'll have these really light yellows, and then I'll have some dark yellows that I paint on top. Now with a smaller flat, I can also go in and start to establish these rock shapes a little better. I'm going to do that by painting the dark shadows that help establish the negative shapes here. And I can darken up this background even more. Here's a little rock in the foreground. I'm going to go around it, paint the shadow shape, paint some ripples. So I'm just working on these detail elements, adding some realism. So the next step will be to do the masking and then come back and add those darker greens. Now I've added some masking fluid and let it dry. I'm going to get my rigger brush ready here. Get some yellow greens that are just a little bit darker than what I have on the page. And I'm going to paint those new grass forms right over the masking fluid, just like this. So if you just gradually build up the grasses, they'll crisscross each other and they'll make those exact shadow patterns that you're trying for. Just always try to paint in the same direction of the natural growth. But I'll move over to the other bush and do the same sort of thing. I don't want it to be too liney, so I'm just going to rub some of that detail out with my finger. Okay, then I'm going to paint some on the figure here. So let me get a small round. And I'll mix up a flesh tone with some reds and yellows, a little bit of brown. And then just sort of quickly add that here in the arms and then here in the legs. And then I'll add a spot or two of some darker color and let that flood down. Then if it needs more shadows after this base tone has dried, I can add that easily. But as long as I'm working on the person, I might as well add some brown to the hair here. Drop in a darker color here at the base. Then in the picture, she's wearing a white tank top and pink shorts. I'll go ahead and stay with those colors, as long as they're not too close to the flesh tone. But this is just the base tone, then when that dries I can lay over some shadow color. And she's walking into the shadows, so her tank top is going to be a little bit blue. Now let it dry completely, then we'll remove the masking fluid and do our final touch-ups. Everything is dry now, so we're going to remove some masking fluid and we're going to add some darks. Let's start by adding some more darks in the grasses. Keep your reference material close at hand, get a small round with plenty of dark on it, and then I'm going to just add some of these really dark shadow shapes that I see at the bank. After adding some dark, I can kind of blend it using a wet brush with the same color on it. And I can do that same process up here where you can see a different shade of green in the background. You can see how they're kind of choppy and weird looking up here at top. And I don't want that. So I'm just going to simplify the shapes by painting over this different shade of green. Let's do some similar work on this side. And on this side there really isn't that same emphasis on dark shapes at the bottom of the bush. It's more light struck over here. So I'll just leave that. And then I'm going to add more of a clear division to her shorts because it's blending into the shirt really a lot. And then I can also add some shadows to her arms and legs, just like this. Okay, once you've incorporated the background and the foreground better by adding those darks, just do a little bit more incorporation here and right in the water. Then it's time to let this dry again so we can remove the masking fluid in the bushes. But I can remove the masking fluid in the background. So let me show you how to do that. The easiest way to remove masking fluid is with a rubber cement eraser. Use small little movements so that you don't tear the paper, and then you can just wipe it like this and take all of that masking fluid off. Here's the painting after removing the masking fluid. And the next step is just going to be to fill in the places where those dots got out of control or where I want it to be a little bit more solid. So I'm going to use a 1/2 inch flat, and I'm going to add a little bit more tone to these tree branches just so that they read more solidly. But don't cover everything because it's still effective to have some areas where the dots are over the trees. And maybe I want to use a large brush and break up a little bit more of this foliage pattern. So I can go back carefully around her arm and just fill in a little bit more of these shapes. The last step here is going to be just cleanup. So there's two ways to do some cleanup. Number one, you go over some of those areas that got too much masking fluid like I already showed you. Number two though is you get a flat shader like this. This is just a craft brush. Get it damp, and then you can gently remove areas where you want the rocks to be more distinct and clean up paint where it shouldn't have gotten. Also, you can use some aqua cover or white paint, and then you can go in and paint some of those lights if you got any lost. So maybe I wanted to strengthen the highlighter in her hair. There I go. Maybe I want some of these weeds to have a little bit more detail. The trick is that you don't want to overdo it, because this is never going to look exactly the same as paper that was kept white. And so if you overdo, it can easily become chalky and artificial and distract from the piece. But I can just add a line here and there, and I'm connecting lines and dots that are already there. That's also a really good way to add some sparkles on the water. See, I can just add a dot or two, and it's shocking how much it adds to the realism of the overall piece. Pan in here and you can see the strength of just adding a few little sparkles. And I can also add a few little weeds breaking up over the water's edge. You can also paint those little rocks if they're wide enough, or use that rub out technique and just lift out a rock, then use a tissue and blot it clean. Then if I need to, I can reshape with a little bit more paint, whatever the surrounding color is. But let me just take a little bit of extra time here off camera, and I'll come back to show you the finished piece. Here's the finished painting after a little bit more blending and rendering. I just added some rocks, pulled out some details in the weeds, and softened up some of the background so it's not quite so stark. So if you're painting along with me, that's your last step as well. And now we have a finished piece. So that's a good place to leave it. As you take the lessons of this tutorial into your own studio, apply them either to this same landscape or to one with similar elements. So a low detail figure and something that needs to be protected with high detail in the midst of kind of a haphazard blend of foliage and a lot of spattering techniques, because that's what we focused on this month. So that is where I'll leave you. Thanks so much for watching, and best of luck in your own studio.